Hey guys, tonight we're talking about what it was actually like to fight in a medieval shield wall. Here's something they don't tell you in the movies. A shield wall wasn't a heroic last stand where brave warriors faced death with noble speeches. It was a meat grinder operated by terrified farmers who'd never killed anything bigger than a pig, pressed shoulder to shoulder so tight you couldn't fall down even if you died. The man next to you might piss himself when the enemy charged, and you'd stand in his warm urine for hours because nobody moved, nobody broke formation, nobody ran, until everybody ran. Medieval combat wasn't about glory. It was about surviving the next 5 seconds while your neighbour's brain matter dried on your face. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support, we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about war history. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. The Ferdman was 23. He'd never seen a clock, never questioned that the king ruled by God's will, never imagined the world as anything but England, Francia and the Holy Land somewhere east where Christ had walked. He knew Harold Godwinson was the rightful king the way he knew winter followed autumn. It was simply true, requiring no proof, needing no debate. The summons had come 8 days ago. A rider on a lathered horse shouting that Duke William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast with an army. Every able man between 15 and 40 was called to the Fyrd, the militia that defended England when professional warriors weren't enough. The Ferdman had grabbed his father's old spear, kissed his wife, and joined the column of men trudging south toward a place called Hastings. Dawn on October 14th, 1066, arrived cold and colourless. Mist clung to the camp like a burial shroud. The Ferdman had slept maybe 2 hours, wedged between strangers who snored and farted and muttered prayers in their dreams. His back ached from the hard ground. His stomach churned with hunger. The army supplies were running thin after the forced march from York, where King Harold had just destroyed a Viking invasion 3 weeks earlier. The smell hit him before his eyes fully opened. Not the clean smell of morning dew. Thousands of men who hadn't bathed in weeks, their bodies slick with the grease they rubbed into leather armour to keep it supple. Smoke from cooking fires mixed with the stench of the latrine trenches. Horses somewhere in the camp, their manure adding another layer to the olfactory assault. He'd stopped noticing it after the 2nd day of marching, but each morning it returned fresh, a reminder that he was far from his farm. He owned no sword. Swords were for thegns, the professional warriors who served the king directly. The Ferdman carried a spear, 8 feet of ashwood topped with a leaf-shaped iron point his blacksmith brother had forged specifically for this war. The spear had cost 2 chickens and a promise to help repair the smithy roof when he returned. If he returned. He tried not to think about that. His shield leaned against a tree. Linden wood, light but strong, 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. His neighbour Oswald had helped him make it, lashing planks together with hide glue, rimming the edge with strips of leather. They'd painted it with lime wash, then added a crude red cross. The priest said the cross would protect him. The priest also said God favoured the English because Harold was the anointed king. The Ferdman wanted to believe both things. The helmet had been his father's, taken from a dead Dane during a raid 15 years ago. Conical, made of iron segments riveted together, with a nasal guard that left most of his face exposed. When he walked, it slid forward and down, the nasal guard poking him in the eye. He'd stuffed the inside with cloth to make it fit better. It still didn't fit. But it was iron, and iron might stop a blade that would split his skull like firewood. He had no mail, Mail cost more than his farm was worth. Instead, he wore a padded gambeson, layers of linen stuffed with wool stitched in a diamond pattern that supposedly spread the impact of blows. His wife had made it, working by candlelight for a month. The gambeson made him sweat even in cold weather. It stank of his fear and his body. Breakfast was stale bread and whatever remained in his pouch. He'd started with cheese, hard sausage and dried apples. Now he had half a loaf gone mouldy on one side. He ate the mouldy part first. Waste nothing. That was the rule on the farm. That was the rule everywhere for men like him. Around him, the army stirred. 7,000 men, maybe 8. Exact numbers didn't matter to a Ferdman. He knew his 100, the local levy from his shire commanded by a thegn named Leofric who owned half the valley. He knew the faces around him, the men he'd drunk with at harvest festivals, whose children played with his children, whose wives gossiped with his wife. Godric, the tanner's son, was sharpening his axe on a whetstone. The rhythmic scraping sound set the Ferdman's teeth on edge. Godric kept making jokes, trying to lighten the mood. "Norman horses won't like our English mud," he said for the 3rd time that morning. "They'll slip and fall, and we'll gut them like pigs at slaughter." Nobody laughed. They'd all heard the stories about Norman cavalry, mounted warriors in full mail striking like thunder, scattering infantry like chaff. Wulfric the blacksmith sat nearby, staring at nothing. His hands trembled. He'd fought at Stamford Bridge against the Vikings, 3 weeks of hard marching ago. He didn't talk about what he'd seen there, but his eyes had a hollowness that hadn't existed before. The Ferdman had asked him once what the fighting was like. Wulfric had looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Pray you die quick." That was the only advice the veteran offered. The Ferdman checked his spear point for the 10th time, sharp enough to punch through leather, maybe through mail if he got lucky and hit a weak point. The shaft was smooth, no splinters to tear his hands during the fighting. He'd wrapped the grip area with leather strips for better hold when everything got slippery with blood and sweat. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He clenched them into fists, released, clenched again. Fear was a living thing in his chest, a cold serpent coiled around his lungs. A horn sounded. Assembly. The army began to organize itself into battle lines. The Ferdman grabbed his shield and spear, settled the ill-fitting helmet on his head, and joined the flow of men moving toward the ridge Harold had chosen for the fight. They'd arrived at this position yesterday afternoon. Senlac Hill, someone called it. A ridge maybe 100 yards wide running east to west. The slope wasn't steep, but it was enough to make attackers fight uphill. Harold knew what he was doing. He'd fought Welsh raiders, Viking berserkers, and rival English earls. He understood terrain. The formation took shape slowly, like a beast waking from sleep. The housecarls, Harold's professional warriors, formed the centre. These men wore mail from neck to knee, carried Danish axes that could split a horse in half, and had killed more men than the Ferdman had years of life. They were the spine of the army. The Ferd extended the line to either side, a mixture of men with spears, axes, clubs, and hope. The shield wall wasn't just standing in a line. It was a specific formation, a tactic the English had used for generations. Front rank locked shields together, overlapping them to create a wooden barrier. Second rank held shields overhead to form a roof against arrows. Third rank and beyond pushed forward, adding weight and replacing the fallen. The Ferdman found himself in the third rank. That was supposed to be safer. The veteran said you had time to see what was happening before you reached the actual killing. The veterans also said men in the third rank died just as dead as men in the first when the line collapsed. Leofric walked the line, checking positions, offering words of encouragement that sounded hollow. "Hold your ground," he kept saying. "The wall doesn't break. We don't break. Easy words for a man in mail with a sword worth more than 10 farms. The Ferdman's position placed him behind Wulfric the blacksmith. The man's broad back blocked most of his view. To his right stood a boy who couldn't be more than 16, holding a spear with white-knuckled hands. To his left, a grey-bearded farmer old enough to be his grandfather, breathing hard just from the walk to position. Dawn gave way to morning. The mist burned off. The Ferdman could see across the valley now, to the far ridge where the Norman army was gathering. They looked like ants at this distance. Then the distance closed and they looked like men. Armed men. Thousands of them. His mouth went dry. He tried to work up saliva to swallow. Failed. Someone passed a water skin down the line. He drank, the water tasting of leather and fear. His stomach cramped. He needed a piss but couldn't leave formation. The waiting was worse than he'd imagined. Every minute stretched into an hour. His shield grew heavier. The sun, weak though it was, felt too bright. Sounds became too loud. Men coughing, armour rattling, someone praying in a whisper that carried like a shout. A veteran near him, a man with a scar bisecting his face, suddenly spoke. "When they come, breathe through your mouth. The smell." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. The Norman army began to move, not charging yet, organising. The Ferdman watched them form up into 3 divisions, archers in front, infantry in the middle, cavalry in the rear. The organisation was terrifying. These weren't farmers called from their fields. These were professionals who'd fought across Francia and now wanted England's crown. His bladder finally gave up. Warm urine ran down his leg, soaking into his trousers, pooling in his boot. Shame burned his face. Then he smelled it from others along the line and realised he wasn't alone. Men preparing to die often lost control of their bodies first. The priest had blessed his shield yesterday, sprinkling holy water while muttering Latin prayers the Ferdman didn't understand. The water had dried, leaving faint marks on the lime-washed wood. He stared at those marks now, trying to find comfort in them. God protected the righteous. Harold was the rightful king. Therefore God would grant victory. The logic was sound. His hands still shook. A ripple passed through the Norman lines. Movement. The archers began to advance, stopping just beyond what looked like effective range. The Ferdman knew nothing about archery beyond using a hunting bow for rabbits. These were war bows, designed to punch through armour at distances that seemed impossible. Wulfric's shoulders tensed. The blacksmith muttered something that might have been a prayer, or might have been a curse. The Ferdman pressed his shield against Wulfric's back, adding his weight to the wall. That was his job. Push when told. Step forward when the man ahead fell. Try not to die. The Norman archers raised their bows. The shield wall wasn't a metaphor. It was engineering, brutal and precise, developed over centuries of Germanic warfare and refined through countless battles where the losing side ended up as crow food. Every man was a component in a machine designed to convert flesh into corpses efficiently. The Ferdman's shield overlapped Wulfric's by 6 inches on the left side. The man to his right overlapped his shield the same distance. This created a continuous wooden barrier with no gaps wide enough for a spear point. The overlap also meant that a blow striking your shield was absorbed partly by your neighbour's shield. The force distributed across multiple men instead of one. Physics that farmers understood instinctively from building fences and stone walls. The second rank held their shields at an angle above the first rank's heads. Not horizontal, that would block vision and trap heat. A slant of maybe 30 degrees, creating a roof that arrows would strike and hopefully deflect. The roof wasn't perfect. Arrows could punch through weak spots in the wood, slip between gaps, or simply come down at such a steep angle they bypassed the protection entirely. But it was better than standing exposed. The third rank, where the Thirdmen stood, had the strangest job. They didn't hold shields overhead. They held them against the backs of the men in front, creating forward pressure. When the enemy hit the wall, the impact would try to drive the front rank backward. The third rank's job was to prevent that, to add their weight and strength so the wall stayed fixed in place, immovable, unbreakable. Except walls broke all the time. The Thirdman had seen a stone wall collapse on his farm when water froze in the cracks and expanded. Shield walls failed the same way. Find the weak point, apply pressure, watch everything crumble. The weak points were obvious once you thought about them. A man smaller or weaker than his neighbours created a soft spot. Exhaustion made men sloppy, their shields drooping, gaps opening. Wounds were catastrophic. A man with a blade in his guts couldn't maintain pressure, and the rupture spread like rot through wood. The key was replacing failures instantly, plugging gaps before the enemy could exploit them. Leofric had explained this during the march south, his voice carrying over the trudging column. The wall lives or dies in 3 seconds after a man falls. New man steps forward, shield locks into place, pressure resumes. Hesitate, and the gap becomes a hole. A hole becomes a breakthrough. Breakthrough becomes slaughter. The veterans enforced discipline through proximity and example. They stood in the front rank or second rank, their experience anchoring the Thirdmen who'd never done this before. The Thirdman could see Leofric 30 feet to his left, mail gleaming dully, Danish axe resting against his shoulder. The Then looked calm. That helped. Not much, but enough. The actual mechanics of fighting from the wall were counterintuitive. Movies showed warriors swinging swords in wide arcs, but you couldn't swing anything in a shield wall. Men stood packed so tight that raising your arm above shoulder height was impossible. Combat happened in a space measured in inches, not feet. Spears were the primary weapon for exactly this reason. The Thirdman's 8-foot spear extended well beyond the first rank, allowing him to stab at enemies while staying behind the shield barrier. Thrust from low, aiming for legs and groins where armour was thinnest. Thrust from high, trying for faces and throats above shield rims. Never throw the spear, that left you with nothing but a belt knife in a battle measured in hours. Axes worked differently. Short-handled axes could hook over enemy shields, dragging them down or aside to create openings for spears. Long-handled Danish axes like the housecarls carried were for when the wall began moving forward, for when the shoving match transitioned into actual advance, and there was room for overhead swings that could split helmets and skulls. Swords were nearly useless in the initial contact. Too short to reach past the front rank, too broad to thrust effectively through narrow gaps. Swords came out when the wall broke and men scattered into individual fights. The Thirdman didn't have a sword anyway, so the tactical limitation didn't matter to him personally. What mattered was the shoving. That's what nobody talked about when they sang songs about battles. The grinding, exhausting physical effort of pushing against other men who were pushing back just as hard. Legs burning from the constant pressure. Shoulders bruising from the shield rim digging into flesh. Feet slipping in mud churned by thousands of boots until the ground became a slurry of dirt and blood and worse things. The wall could advance slowly if the enemy gave ground. 1 step forward, shields locked. Another step. The corpses underfoot became obstacles that tripped attackers and had to be stepped over carefully while maintaining formation. Advancing was dangerous. It stretched the line, created gaps, tested discipline. Harold's orders were clear. Hold the ridge. Don't pursue broken enemies. Let them come to you and die on your spears. The Thirdman understood the strategy intellectually. Emotionally, he understood nothing except the terror of waiting for violence to arrive. His legs trembled. The shield felt like it weighed 50 pounds instead of 15. Sweat ran down his ribs despite the October cold. Then the Norman arrows released. The sound came first, not individual strings snapping, but a collective whoosh, like wind through winter trees. The Ferdman looked up instinctively, immediately regretted it. The sky had darkened. Hundreds of arrows at the peak of their arc, black against grey clouds beginning their descent. Someone screamed the order, "Shields up." The second rank tightened their roof. The Ferdman raised his shield overhead, angling it, praying the linden wood would hold. Impact sounded like hail on a thatched roof, sharp and rapid and everywhere at once. The shield jolted in his grip as an arrow struck, the force travelling down his arm. Another hit. A third glanced off the edge. He couldn't see anything now, just the back of his shield and the splinters appearing where arrowheads punched through. The man to his right made a wet, choking sound. The Ferdman risked a glance. Arrow through the throat, the shaft protruding front and back, blood pumping in rhythm with the dying heartbeat. The man tried to speak, managed only a gurgle, then collapsed. Someone from the fourth rank immediately stepped into the gap. The wall didn't pause. More arrows fell. The rattling continued, relentless. The Ferdman's arms burned from holding the shield overhead. An arrow pierced the wood 2 inches from his face. He saw the iron point emerge, saw the fletching quivering from the impact. Too close. Much too close. The barrage stopped as suddenly as it started. The Ferdman lowered his shield, gasping. His arms shook from the strain. Around him men were doing the same, checking themselves for wounds, often finding them. Blood already slicked the ground. Bodies dotted the formation like stones in a field. The battle hadn't even truly begun, an English dead already numbered in dozens. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about war history. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The Norman infantry began their advance before the English could fully recover. They came at a walk, not a run, preserving energy for the fight ahead. Their shields formed their own wall, painted with crosses and Norman devices the Ferdman didn't recognise. Their helmets gleamed. Their mail rustled like scales on some enormous serpent. Distance collapsed faster than seemed possible. 200 yards, 100, 50. The Ferdman could see individual faces now, bearded men, some young, some old, all terrified beneath the professional competence. They were someone's sons, someone's husbands. In another world he might have shared ale with them. In this world he would try to kill them, and they would try to kill him, and the winner would be whoever made the fewest mistakes in the next few minutes. 30 yards. The Normans began shouting. Not words, just noise. A battle cry meant to intimidate, to spark fear, to make English hearts quail. It worked. The Ferdman's bladder had emptied already, or he would have pissed himself again. His mouth tasted like metal. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused on Wulfric's back and the approaching enemy. 20 yards. He could smell them now. Different from English smell, but fundamentally the same. Sweat and leather and fear, the universal perfume of men about to die. The veterans in the front rank braced themselves. Knees bent slightly, shields locked tight, spears angled forward. They knew what was coming. The Ferdmen in the rear ranks knew only that something terrible was about to happen, and there was no escape. 10 yards. The Norman shout reached a crescendo. Individual voices merged into a roar like surf-pounding rocks. The sound was a physical thing, pressing against the English line, testing resolve before steel tested flesh. 5 yards. The Ferdman pushed his shield hard against Wulfric's back, adding his weight to the wall. Every muscle in his body tensed. Time seemed to slow and accelerate simultaneously. He could count the rivets in a Norman helmet. He could see a gap-toothed man screaming something in French. He could see the spear point aimed at Wulfric's face. Then they hit. The collision didn't sound like metal on metal. It sounded like a butcher's shop, wet impacts, cracking wood, and the bass drum of bodies slamming together. The shockwave travelled through the shield wall like an earthquake, buckling knees, stealing breath, turning organised ranks into a compressed mass of struggling men. The Ferdman's shield crushed against Wulfric's back hard enough to crack ribs. His feet skidded backward through mud despite his weight being planted. The man behind him prevented the slide, pushing forward with his own shield, creating a human vice that squeezed the air from the Ferdman's lungs. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only push. The Norman line had hit with identical force, their shields meeting English shields in a collision that physics demanded and neither side could avoid. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. 2 walls of wood and flesh pressing against each other with the combined strength of thousands of men, each side trying to drive the other backward through sheer muscular effort. Then the killing started. Spear points appeared in gaps the Ferdman hadn't known existed. A blade flashed past Wulfric's shoulder, aimed at the Ferdman's face. He jerked his head sideways. The point scraped across his helmet with a sound like a file on iron. His own spear, held under hand, thrust forward blindly into the press of bodies ahead. The resistance was wrong. Not the firm pushback of a shield block, but something softer. Cloth and flesh. He pulled back and the spear point was red. Wulfric grunted and shifted left. Through the gap the Ferdman glimpsed a Norman with an axe hooked over an English shield, dragging it down. The English Ferdman whose shield was being pulled tried to hold on, lost his grip and immediately took a spear through his open mouth. The blade exited the back of his skull. He didn't scream, just stopped being alive. The wall absorbed the gap instantly. A man from the second rank stepped forward, shield raised, and the barrier reformed. The Norman who'd made the kill had no time to celebrate. An English spear took him in the eye, punching through the socket and into his brain. He fell forward, dead before he hit the ground. The Ferdman couldn't see the individual fights anymore. His world had compressed to a space 3 feet wide and 1 foot deep. Wulfric's back, the shields to either side, the glimpses of Norman mail and English blood. His arms moved automatically, thrust, withdraw, thrust. The spear struck shields, glanced off helmets, occasionally found flesh. Each time it found flesh, the resistance changed. Softer than wood, firmer than cloth. He stopped thinking about what he was stabbing. The smell arrived like a physical assault. Not the morning's unwashed bodies, but something fundamentally more offensive. Shit and blood mixed into a reek that made his eyes water. Someone nearby had been gutted, and their intestines had spilled. The smell of human waste overwhelmed everything else. Men were vomiting in the ranks. The Ferdman tasted bile but swallowed it down. Vomiting meant looking down, and looking down meant missing the spear aimed at your face. Sound became texture instead of information. Screaming had no words, just pitch and volume. High screams from men with battlefield wounds discovering what real pain felt like. Low grunts from men pushing with everything they had. The constant scrape of metal on metal, wood on wood, blade on bone. Beneath it all, a wet squelching that was boots in mud mixed with blood mixed with things that had been inside people moments before. A Norman sword appeared through a gap in the shields. The blade was short, designed for stabbing rather than slashing. It caught the boy to the Ferdman's right in the armpit where his gambeson was thinnest. The boy's arm went limp. The sword withdrew, appeared again, this time targeting the boy's neck. Found it. blood sprayed in an arc that painted 3 men red. The boy's body stayed upright, wedged in place by the press of men, dead but still standing. Someone hauled the corpse backward. A replacement stepped forward. The wall held. The Ferdman's shield was dying. He could feel it through his arm, the wood flexing wrong, stress cracks spreading, the structure weakening. An axe blade had bitten deep into the rim earlier. Now each impact widened the crack. The shield wouldn't last another minute of this punishment. Wulfric suddenly lurched backward, forcing the Ferdman back a step. A Norman spear had punched through the blacksmith's shield and scored his shoulder. Not a killing wound, but enough to weaken his position. Wulfric's legs shook. The man was running out of strength. The Ferdman pressed harder against Wulfric's back, literally holding him upright through shield pressure. If Wulfric fell, the Ferdman would inherit the front rank position. He wasn't ready. Nobody was ready. But the wall didn't care about readiness. Time lost meaning in the grinding press. Seconds felt like hours. The Ferdman's legs burned with lactic acid build-up. His shoulders were numb from the constant pressure. Sweat ran into his eyes, stinging, blurring his vision. He blinked it away and immediately wished he hadn't. He'd caught a glimpse of what was happening at ground level. The dead had formed a carpet. English and Norman mixed together, their blood indistinguishable, their bodies locked in final embraces of violence. Some men weren't quite dead yet. They writhed and moaned under the boots of living men who had no choice but to step on them. The wounded were drowning in the churned mud, their faces pressed into the slurry, suffocating while their comrades fought inches above their heads. A hand grabbed the Ferdman's ankle. He looked down. A Norman, gutted but still conscious, was trying to pull himself up using the Ferdman's leg. The man's intestines dragged behind him like rope. His eyes held a pleading expression, for mercy, for help, for an end to pain. The Ferdman kicked the hand away and stomped on the Norman's face. The skull cracked. The hand released. That was mercy in a shield wall. His spear shaft snapped. The Ferdman had been pushing forward during a thrust, and the shaft met resistance it couldn't overcome. Norman shield or Norman bone, he didn't know which. The wood split lengthwise and the weapon became useless. He dropped it and grabbed for his belt knife, but there was no room to use a knife in this press. He needed a new weapon immediately. A dead English Ferdman lay at his feet, spear still gripped in death-locked hands. The Ferdman pried the fingers open, took the weapon, and resumed fighting. The new spear was shorter, maybe 6 feet. Good enough. He thrust it past Wulfric's side, felt it bite something, withdrew and thrust again. The Norman pressure suddenly eased. Not a retreat, but a reorganization. Their front rank was exhausted, being rotated back to let fresh men take their place. The maneuver was professional, practiced. The Normans clearly knew how to maintain a shield wall through sustained combat. The English had no such rotation system. Men fought until they dropped or died. But the momentary release of pressure allowed the English wall to breathe. Men gasped for air. Water skins appeared from somewhere, passed hand to hand. The Ferdman drank without tasting, his throat too raw to register anything but wetness. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the spear. Wulfric turned his head slightly, enough for the Ferdman to see his profile. The blacksmith's face was grey. Blood from his shoulder wound had soaked his entire left side. He was standing through willpower alone. When the Normans came again, and they would come again, Wulfric wouldn't survive. The pause lasted maybe 2 minutes, long enough to count the English dead in the immediate area. The Ferdman counted 17 bodies. 17 men from his shire who'd been alive at dawn. How many more were down along the entire line? Hundreds. The battle had barely started. The Normans formed up for another push. New men in the front rank, fresh and ready. The English had no reserves to rotate in. The same exhausted Ferdmen would face the second charge, and the third, and the fourth, until they broke, or won, or died. A horn sounded from the Norman lines. The fresh troops began their advance. They moved faster this time, jogging instead of walking. They'd learned from the first contact hitting hard and fast prevented the English from bracing properly. The Ferdman set his feet in the mud, pushed his shield against Wulfric's back, lowered his new spear. His arms felt like lead weights, his legs trembled. Exhaustion had already set in, and the real fighting had only just begun. The Normans crashed into the wall again. This time the impact drove the English back 3 feet before they could set and push. Men stumbled over corpses. Shields slipped in blood-slicked hands. The wall bent, warped, but somehow held. Wulfric took a sword thrust through his damaged shield. The blade entered just below his collarbone and exited near his spine. He made a sound like a sigh. His legs buckled. He fell forward onto the Norman who'd killed him, and both men went down in the press. The Ferdman stepped over Wulfric's corpse into the front rank. His shield immediately locked with a Norman shield. He could see the enemy's eyes through the narrow gap. Blue eyes, wide with the same terror the Ferdman felt. They pushed against each other, the Ferdman's tired legs versus the Norman's fresh strength. The Norman began driving him back. A spear thrust from behind the Ferdman caught the Norman in the throat. The blue eyes went blank. The pressure released. Another Norman stepped into the gap before the body even fell. The Ferdman was in the front rank now. This was where men died fastest. This was where the real killing happened. He'd survived maybe 30 seconds so far. The grinding continued. The front rank existed in a reality separate from the rest of the army. Time didn't flow. It stuttered and jumped. One moment the Ferdman was blocking a sword thrust. The next he was stabbing at a gap that had appeared. Between these moments, entire seconds vanished into a fog of survival instinct. His shield absorbed impacts he didn't consciously register. Each blow weakened the linden wood further. The crack from the earlier axe strike had spread across the entire face, held together now by the leather rim and prayer. The next solid hit would split it completely. The Norman facing him swung a short-handled axe at the shield's edge. The Ferdman angled it, letting the blade glance off rather than bite. The axeman immediately reversed his swing, aiming for the Ferdman's ankle. He lifted his foot just in time. The axe blade buried itself in a corpse instead. While the Norman struggled to free his weapon, an English spear took him through the side of his neck. He fell gurgling. No time to process. Another Norman stepped forward instantly. This one carried a spear and knew how to use it. He thrust low, forcing the Ferdman to drop his shield to block, then thrust high at the exposed face. The Ferdman jerked his head back. The spear point missed his eye by less than an inch, scraped across his helmet with a shriek of metal. The Ferdman counter-thrust. His spear found the Norman shield, punched through the wood but stuck fast. He tried to withdraw. Couldn't. The Norman twisted his shield, trapping the spear shaft, leaving the Ferdman weaponless for 2 critical seconds. The Norman's spear drove toward the Ferdman's chest. A hand from behind grabbed the Ferdman's shoulder, yanked him sideways. The spear point passed through the space where his heart had been. The man who'd saved him, the old grey-bearded farmer, immediately thrust his own spear into the Norman's face. Blood and teeth sprayed. The Ferdman abandoned his trapped spear, grabbed a fallen axe instead. The haft was slippery with blood, but the weight felt right. Axes needed less precision than spears in the grinding press of the wall. Swing, impact something, swing again. The axe didn't care if it hit shield or helmet or flesh. His damaged shield finally gave up. A Norman sword split it vertically, the blade stopping only when it hit the iron rim. The shield fell apart in 2 pieces. The Thirdman dropped the useless remnants and grabbed a replacement from a corpse behind him. This new shield was heavier, made of oak instead of linden. Harder to maneuver but more resistant to damage. The Norman line surged forward. The English gave ground, 6 inches, then a foot, then 2 feet. Men were stumbling backward, tripping over the carpet of dead. The wall was bending. Not breaking yet, but the curve was forming, the weak point becoming visible. A housecarl to the Thirdman's left saw the danger. The veteran warrior raised his Danish axe and brought it down in a massive overhead swing that split a Norman shield, the arm holding it, and part of the man's chest. The sheer violence of the blow shocked both sides into a momentary pause. The housecarl used that pause to bellow something wordless and furious, rallying the Thirdmen around him. The English line stiffened, stopped giving ground, began pushing back. The Thirdman swung his axe at a Norman helmet. The blade glanced off the iron, but the impact stunned the man long enough for someone's spear to find his groin. The Norman collapsed, screaming. Boots trampled him into silence. A sword appeared from nowhere and opened the Thirdman's left forearm from elbow to wrist. The cut was clean and deep, severing muscle. His arm went numb immediately. The shield fell from his nerveless fingers. He was exposed, weaponless on his left side in the front rank where being exposed meant dying within seconds. The grey-bearded farmer stepped into the gap, his shield covering the Thirdman's left. The old man's face was splattered with blood that wasn't his own. He fought with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd stopped being afraid and accepted death. His spear thrust and withdrew, each movement economical and precise. The Thirdman's left arm hung useless. Blood poured from the wound, running down to his fingers, dripping onto his boots. He could still swing the axe with his right hand. That would have to be enough. A Norman spear thrust past the greybeard's shield, aimed at the Thirdman's exposed left side. He couldn't dodge. The press of men behind him prevented movement. The spear point entered his side just below the ribs, punching through his gambeson. The Thirdman felt the blade scrape against bone as it penetrated. Cold fire spread from the wound. He swung his axe with everything he had left. The blade caught the Norman under the chin, nearly severing his head. The Norman fell. His spear fell with him, still lodged in the Thirdman's side. The shaft protruded from his body like a handle. The pain arrived in a wave that whited out his vision. When it cleared, he was on his knees, still in the front rank somehow, kneeling in mud and blood and worse, trying to breathe through lungs that didn't want to inflate. The spear in his side shifted with each breath, grinding against his ribs. Hands grabbed him from behind, dragged him backward through the ranks. The grey-bearded farmer stepped forward to fill the gap. The Thirdman caught one last glimpse of the old man's face, calm, almost peaceful, before he disappeared into the wall. They hauled the Thirdman past the third rank, past the fourth, into the area where the wounded collected. Someone lowered him to the ground. The world swam. Faces appeared above him, speaking words he couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. A man with a leather apron, the army surgeon, examined the spear in his side. The surgeon gripped the shaft, braced his foot against the Thirdman's hip and pulled. The Thirdman screamed. The spear didn't move. It had caught on something inside. The surgeon tried again. This time the spear came free with a wet sucking sound. Blood welled from the wound. More than seemed possible from a hole that size. The surgeon packed it with cloth torn from a dead man's tunic, pressed hard to slow the bleeding. The Thirdman tried to speak, managed only a cough that sprayed blood. The surgeon shook his head, a gesture that needed no translation. The wound was mortal, minutes or hours, but the outcome was certain. Except the bleeding slowed. The surgeon's expression changed from resigned to surprised. He packed more cloth into the wound, this time with less urgency. The spear had missed the major organ somehow, threading between ribs and vital structures through pure chance. The third man might survive. Might. Someone gave him water. He drank, coughed half of it up, drank more. The pain in his side had settled into a deep ache that pulsed with his heartbeat. His left arm remained numb and useless, though feeling was starting to return in hot needles of sensation. Around him, the wounded sprawled in various states of dying. A man with his jaw hanging by a strip of skin, another with an arrow through both eyes, a third clutching his split-open belly, trying to hold his intestines inside his body cavity. The surgeon moved between them, making quick assessments. This one might live. That one was already dead. This one would die slowly without intervention, so better to give him mercy now. The battle continued 50 yards away. The third man could hear it. The constant roar of combat punctuated by screams. He couldn't see the wall from his position on the ground. Didn't know if it still held. Didn't know if the grey-bearded farmer who'd saved him was alive or trampled into the mud. The Norman assault broke off again. The sudden quiet was somehow more disturbing than the noise had been. Men had grown accustomed to the sound of killing. Its absence felt wrong. A water carrier moved through the wounded offering drinks. When he reached the third man, recognition sparked in his eyes. Godric, the tanner's son. The joker from the march. His humour had died somewhere in the past hour. He helped the third man drink, then moved on without speaking. The third man tested his left arm. The fingers moved sluggishly. He could feel pain now, which the surgeon had said was good. It meant the nerves weren't completely severed. The wound had stopped bleeding through the bandage. His side throbbed, but the pain was manageable if he didn't breathe too deeply. He tried to stand, failed, tried again, using his axe as a crutch. This time he made it upright, though the world tilted alarmingly. The surgeon noticed, rushed over, tried to push him back down. The third man shook his head. The wall needed every man. The surgeon started to argue, then saw something in the third man's face that stopped him. He helped bind the arm tightly against the chest to prevent it from swinging. Checked the side wound one more time. Handed the third man a spear to use as a walking stick. The third man limped back toward the shield wall. Each step sent lightning through his side. His left arm screamed against its bindings. His legs barely supported his weight. He reached the rear ranks and pushed forward. Men made space for him, not out of respect, but because wounded men in the rear ranks were common now. Everyone was wounded. The question was merely degree. A cut arm and stabbed side qualified as light injuries compared to what the third man could see ahead. He found a position in the fourth rank, close enough to push when needed, far enough back to avoid immediate death. A man handed him a proper shield to replace the one he'd lost. The third man took it in his right hand. His left couldn't grip anymore. The Normans were forming up for another assault. Fresh troops again, pulled from reserves that seemed endless. How many men had Duke William brought? The third man had heard estimates ranging from 7,000 to 15,000. Against the English 8,000, many of whom were already dead or wounded beyond fighting. A horn sounded. The Norman advance began. The third man set his feet and raised his shield. He'd survived the front rank once. Probably couldn't survive it again. But the wall needed bodies and he was still vertical. The lines crashed together for the third time. The impact was less shocking from the fourth rank. The third man pushed against the man ahead, adding his weight to the wall. His wounded side protested every movement. He ignored it. Pain meant he was still alive. The grinding resumed, endless and mechanical. Push. Step forward over corpses. Push again. Listen to men dying in front of you. Push harder when the pressure increases. The Thirdman had become part of the machine. Individual thought had surrendered to group survival. Time dissolved into a series of disconnected images. A Norman breaking through the third rank before being swarmed and stabbed to death. The grey-bearded farmer's body being dragged backward, his chest opened by an axe. Godric appearing in the line 2 positions over, his leg crudely bandaged but still fighting. The sun moving across the sky, marking hours that felt like years. The Normans fell back again. The English wall stood, diminished but unbroken. The Thirdman looked at the faces around him. Half were strangers, replacements from other hundreds, filling gaps where entire units had been slaughtered. The original formation from his shire had been destroyed. He was fighting beside men whose names he didn't know, probably would never learn. The battle had only just begun. The Normans changed tactics during the lull. Instead of reforming their infantry immediately, they pulled the archers forward. Hundreds of them, spreading across the valley floor in a loose formation that allowed each bowman clear sky above. The Thirdman recognised the danger before the order to raise shields came. Archers could kill from safety, could rain death on men too exhausted to dodge, could turn a defensive position into a killing ground without risking a single Norman life in close combat. The shield roof had barely worked during the first barrage when men were fresh. Now, with shields damaged and arms trembling from fatigue, the protection would be far less effective. The English commanders understood the same mathematics. Shouted orders rippled down the line. 2nd rank shields up, 3rd rank fill the gaps. 4th rank, which included the Thirdman, prepare to move forward if the ranks ahead collapsed. The archers drew in unison. The Thirdman watched them nock arrows, muscles moving with practiced efficiency. These weren't farmers conscripted for war. These were professionals who'd trained since childhood, men who could put an arrow through a gap in armour at 100 yards. The first volley launched skyward in a dark cloud. The Thirdman raised his shield overhead with his right arm. His left remained bound and useless. The weight pressed on shoulders already screaming with exhaustion. He braced his feet, lowered his head, and waited for the storm. Impact came as a hammering cacophony. Arrows struck his shield in rapid succession. Thunk, 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 each hit driving the shield downward against his straining arm. One arrowhead punched completely through, the point stopping inches from his face. Another glanced off the rim and buried itself in the ground by his foot. Men screamed. The shield roof had gaps where damage from earlier fighting had weakened the wood. Arrows found these gaps like water finding cracks, pouring through and striking the men beneath. The Thirdman heard a wet impact to his left, followed by choking. He didn't look. Looking meant lowering the shield. The second volley arrived before the first had finished. Norman archers could loose 12 arrows per minute in sustained fire. The math was brutal. 600 archers meant more than 7,000 arrows in the air every 60 seconds. The English formation held 8,000 men packed into a space 300 yards wide. Every arrow had excellent odds of hitting flesh. A scream from the 2nd rank, directly ahead of the Thirdman. An arrow had punched through a shield and into the man's eye. The shaft protruded from the socket, fletching visible, the man still somehow standing. He pawed at it with one hand while trying to hold his shield with the other. Blood and clear fluid ran down his face. The third volley hit harder than the previous two. The Normans had adjusted their range, increasing the arc. Arrows now fell nearly vertical, punching through the angled shield roof at optimal angles. The Thirdman's shield took 4 hits simultaneously. The wood cracked with sounds like breaking bones. A 5th arrow punched through completely, the broadhead slicing across his scalp. Hot blood ran into his eyes. Head wounds bled spectacularly, even when shallow. The thirdman couldn't tell if his skull was split or merely scratched. Pain made no distinction. The man with the arrow through his eye finally fell. His replacement stepped up from the third rank, only to take an arrow through the throat within seconds. He collapsed, gurgling. Another replacement stepped forward. This one lasted perhaps 10 seconds before an arrow found the gap between his helmet and shoulder, severing something vital. He dropped. The fourth rank was being consumed to feed the second. Men stepped forward into certain death because the alternative was watching the shield wall collapse. The thirdman's turn would come soon, a minute, maybe less, before the bodies piled high enough that he'd be called forward into the arrow storm. Someone nearby took a hit through the top of his skull. The arrow had fallen with such force it penetrated the iron helmet, driving through bone and brain to emerge from the jaw. The man didn't make a sound, simply stopped being vertical. The thirdman's shield was dying. Arrows protruded from it like the quills of some massive hedgehog. The wood was more whole than solid material now. One more volley would render it useless. He scanned the ground for a replacement, found only bodies and men standing on bodies and shields so damaged they weren't worth taking. The fifth volley transformed the shield roof into Swiss cheese. Arrows came through gaps, through damaged shields, through shields that had absorbed too many hits and simply gave up. The man directly in front of the thirdman took 3 arrows in rapid succession: shoulder, back, leg. He collapsed forward. The thirdman stepped over him into the third rank. Arrows immediately targeted the new position. One glanced off his helmet with a sound like a bell ringing. Another hit his shield and stuck, adding weight. A third skipped off the ground and came up under the shield rim, slicing through his boot and into his foot. The thirdman gasped but held position. The foot could bleed. He could limp. He couldn't abandon the wall. The barrage continued relentlessly. Norman archers worked in rotation, one group shooting while another knocked arrows, maintaining constant fire without pause. The English had no answer. Their own archers were few and poorly positioned. Throwing spears at distant targets wasted weapons. The only option was endurance. A man 2 positions over went mad from the strain. He threw down his shield and ran, made it perhaps 10 yards before arrows found his unprotected back. He fell riddled with shafts, his body twitching. Nobody retrieved him. Nobody could. The thirdman's damaged shield finally surrendered. An arrow hit the central crack and the entire face split apart. He dropped the pieces and grabbed for a dead man's shield, nearly fell doing it, got his hand on the rim and dragged it upright just as another volley descended. Arrows hammered the new shield. This one held. Barely. His vision was blurring from the head wound. Blood kept running into his eyes no matter how many times he blinked it away. His foot throbbed where the arrow had penetrated. His side wound had reopened, fresh blood soaking through the bandage. His bound left arm was useless weight. The second rank in front of him was being decimated. Men fell faster than replacements could step forward. Gaps appeared in the shield roof. Through one gap the thirdman glimpsed the Norman archers drawing for another volley. The distance seemed impossible. They were barely dots on the landscape, yet their arrows arrived with the force of hatred made tangible. An arrow took the man in front of the thirdman through the back of the neck. The point emerged from his mouth. He fell without ceremony. The thirdman stepped forward into the second rank, raised his shield overhead at an angle, became part of the roof. The exposure was terrifying. First and second ranks caught the full weight of the arrow storm. The thirdman could see the volleys launching now, watch the dark clouds rise and peak and begin their descent. 2 seconds from launch to impact. 2 seconds to wonder which arrow had his name scratched into the shaft. A volley descended. His shield took 7 hits. The impacts travelled down his arm like hammer blows. One arrow punched through and opened his shoulder. Another hit his helmet hard enough to dent the iron. A third struck the shield's edge and deflected into the man beside him, entering his armpit and emerging from his chest. The man died standing upright, held in place by the press of bodies. The thirdman's right arm was giving out. The shield felt like it weighed 100 pounds. His muscles had been pushed past their limit hours ago and were now operating on nothing but desperation. The shield dipped. He caught it, forced it back up, felt something tear in his shoulder. The shield dipped again. An arrow meant for his head hit the lowered shield instead. The broadhead punched through and embedded in his right bicep. The thirdman screamed. His arm went partially numb. The shield began to fall. He caught it with his bound left hand, grabbed despite the sliced forearm, held the shield up through willpower that had no physical basis. Both arms were wounded now. Blood ran from multiple injuries. He'd lost enough blood that the world had developed strange colour patterns. Too bright in some places, too dark in others. His legs trembled. He was going to fall soon. The only question was whether he'd fall backward into support or forward into the mud and death. The arrow storm suddenly ceased. The thirdman lowered his shield a fraction, trying to see through blood-crusted eyes. The Norman archers were withdrawing, not retreating, repositioning, making space for something else. Infantry appeared at the far tree line. Fresh troops, probably the 3rd or 4th rotation. The Normans had an inexhaustible supply of men, it seemed. Each wave came rested while the English had no reserves, no rotation, no relief. The enemy infantry advanced while the thirdman stood swaying in the second rank, both arms wounded, his foot pierced, his side bleeding, his head split. He should have been dead 3 times over. Stubbornness and luck had kept him vertical. Those were finite resources. The Norman line was 50 yards away, 40, 30. They came faster than before, having learned that speed prevented the English from properly bracing. The thirdman planted his feet, brought his damaged shield to ready position, and prepared to be hit by men who weren't wounded, weren't exhausted, weren't operating on fumes. 20 yards. He could see their faces again. Young men, old men, all wearing the same expression of focused terror. They were as scared as he was. That provided no comfort. 10 yards. The Norman battle cry rose. The English answered with a roar that came from 8,000 throats diminished to perhaps 6,000. Too many had fallen. Too many gaps existed in the line. The wall was holding through collective stubbornness rather than tactical soundness. 5 yards. The thirdman sucked in a breath that tasted like copper. Set his weight. Knew this was probably his last moment of life. Accepted it with a calm that surprised him. Impact. The collision drove him back 3 full steps. His wounded foot couldn't hold. He started to fall. Hands from behind caught him, shoved him forward, kept him in position through force. He was a component in the machine again. Individual survival didn't matter. The wall mattered. His shield met a Norman shield. They pushed against each other. The Norman was stronger, fresher, winning the contest. The thirdman felt his feet sliding backward through mud. A spear appeared beside him, thrust by someone in the 3rd rank, caught the Norman in the armpit. The pressure released. Another Norman immediately filled the gap. This one swung an axe at the thirdman's head. He got his shield up just barely. The axe bit deep into the wood, stuck fast. The Norman tried to yank it free. The thirdman twisted his shield, pulling the axe and the Norman off balance. Someone's sword took advantage, opening the Norman's throat. Blood sprayed across the thirdman's face, hot and copper tasting. He'd long since stopped being disgusted by it. Blood was just another substance in the nightmare. no more remarkable than mud or shit or the clear fluid that leaked from punctured eyeballs. His shield finally gave up completely. The axe damage had been terminal. The rim separated from the face. The boards fell apart. He dropped the useless pieces and fought with nothing but his spear, one-armed, barely conscious, held upright by the men behind him as much as his own strength. A Norman sword came for his exposed side. He couldn't block it, couldn't dodge, watched it come with a strange detachment. Then Godric was there, shield raised, deflecting the blow. The tanner's son fought beside him now, both of them wounded beyond reason, both of them still fighting because the alternative was dying like cattle. The grinding continued. The Ferdman thrust his spear when gaps appeared, leaned on Godric when his legs failed, took support from behind when he started to collapse. The individual had ceased to exist. Only the collective remained. The wall, the machine, the desperate mathematics of survival measured in minutes and inches. The Norman infantry withdrew after an hour of grinding combat that felt like a day. They pulled back in good order, shields raised, maintaining formation even in retreat. Professional soldiers who knew that broken retreats invited slaughter. The English didn't pursue. Harold's orders remained absolute. Hold the ridge, maintain the wall, let the enemy break themselves against English steel. The strategy was sound. The execution was costing thousands of lives. The Ferdman collapsed where he stood. His legs simply quit, dumping him into mud churned to the consistency of porridge by the passage of 20,000 boots. He landed on something soft that might have been a body or might have been pieces of multiple bodies. Didn't matter. Everything at ground level was meat now. Godric hauled him upright. The tanner's son had a fresh wound across his forehead that bled into his eyes, but he was mobile, functional. More than could be said for half the men still standing. They propped each other up, two wounded men making one semi-functional fighter. Water came down the line again. The Ferdman drank without tasting. His throat was so raw that swallowing felt like ingesting broken glass. He didn't care. Dehydration killed as surely as Norman blades. The sun had climbed past its zenith. Afternoon now, though what hour exactly the Ferdman couldn't guess. Time had stopped having meaning measured in minutes or hours. Only states existed. Fighting, not fighting. Alive, dead. He was currently in the alive not fighting state. That could change at any moment. A quick count of the men still standing in his immediate area produced horrifying numbers. His original 100 from the Shire had numbered exactly that. 100 men. Now he could see maybe 20 faces he recognised. 80% casualties. The gaps had been filled with strangers from other shires, other hundreds, other parts of the disintegrating English formation. The Norman army was reorganising in the valley below. The Ferdman could see it clearly from the ridge's height. Infantry pulling back to the rear, archers repositioning to the flanks, and something new moving forward from the Norman camp. Cavalry. Hundreds of mounted warriors on destriers bred for war. The horses alone were worth more than entire English villages. The riders wore full mail, carried lances and swords, represented the cutting edge of Norman military technology. Knights who'd trained for years to fight from horseback against enemies who fought on foot. Horses wouldn't charge a solid shield wall. Every soldier knew this. Horses were animals, possessed of survival instincts that prevented them from running into an obvious barrier. Cavalry worked best against broken formations, scattered men, enemies already fleeing. Against a locked shield wall holding firm ground, cavalry was supposed to be useless. But the English wall was no longer locked or firm. Gaps existed where entire sections had been slaughtered. The line had bent and warped from constant pressure. Dead men and dead horses from earlier skirmishing littered the slope, creating obstacles that disrupted the formation. The Normans had spent hours weakening the wall specifically to make it vulnerable to cavalry. The knights began their advance at a walk. The sound of hundreds of hooves on turf created a low thunder that the Ferdman felt through the ground before he heard it. The horses snorted and tossed their heads. The riders held their lances upright, not yet lowered for the charge. Harold's dragon banner whipped in the wind at the centre of the English line. The king himself stood there, surrounded by his best housecarls, the professional warriors who'd followed him through a decade of battles. If the cavalry broke through, they'd go for the banner. Kill the king, and the army would scatter. Basic tactics. The wall reformed as best it could. Men dragged themselves into position. Wounded fighters took their places because there were no unwounded fighters left. Shields locked together, those that remained intact enough to lock. Spears lowered. The front rank braced for impact. The Ferdman stood in the third rank now, having been pushed backward during the last rotation. Godric beside him, both of them using their spears as much for support as weapons. Around them, men were praying. Christian prayers to Christ and the saints, older prayers to older gods that the church pretended didn't exist, prayers to luck, to fate, to anything that might tip the odds toward survival. The cavalry reached a trot, lances lowered in unison, a forest of wood and iron points aimed at the English line. The riders began shouting, war cries in French that the Ferdman didn't understand but felt in his gut. The sound of mounted killers announcing their arrival. 50 yards from the wall, the horses broke into a canter, not a gallop. The slope and the obstacles prevented that, but fast enough that the impact would be devastating. 1,000 pounds of horse and armoured rider hitting at speed could shatter bones, crush organs, turn men into pulp. 30 yards. The English front rank set their spears at an angle, butts braced against the ground, points aimed at horse chests. The tactic was simple. Let the horses impale themselves on the spears. A horse wouldn't willingly run onto a blade. The front rank was betting their lives that animal instinct would overcome rider control. 20 yards. Some horses shied, trying to turn away from the spear wall. Their riders forced them forward with spurs and reins and brutal determination. Other horses, better trained or more terrified of their riders than of the spears, continued straight. 10 yards. The Ferdman could see individual horses now, the foam at their mouths, the whites of their rolling eyes, the muscles bunching under their hides, magnificent animals being driven to their deaths by men who viewed them as weapons. Impact came as chaos rather than collision. Some horses did impale themselves on the waiting spears, screaming in voices that sounded horrifyingly human. Others crashed into the shield wall at angles, trampling men, kicking with iron-shod hooves, creating havoc through sheer mass and momentum. A destrier broke through the first rank entirely, its momentum carrying it into the second rank where it crushed 2 men under its hooves before a housecarl's axe opened its throat. The horse fell, pinning 3 more men. Its rider, unhorsed but alive, drew his sword and began killing with professional efficiency before English spears found the gaps in his mail. Another horse reared at the last moment rather than impaling itself. Its rider managed to stay mounted, used the elevated position to swing a mace down into the English ranks. The spiked ball crushed a man's skull, caved in another's shoulder, demolished a shield. Then someone hamstrung the horse. It collapsed sideways, crushing its rider's leg. English daggers finished both. The Ferdman watched a Norman knight drive his lance through an English Ferdman's chest, the point emerging from the man's back, lifting him off the ground. The knight released the lance and drew his sword in one smooth motion, cutting down 2 more men before his horse stumbled on a corpse and fell. The knight hit the ground hard, stunned. He was still trying to rise when boots and blades found him. Horses were dying in droves. The English spear wall, weakened though it was, still presented enough of a barrier that horses paid the price for their riders' ambitions. Dead horses became obstacles that living horses had to navigate, slowing the charge, creating bottlenecks where English spears could work methodically. But horses were also breaking the wall. Sections collapsed where a mounted warrior punched through, his horse's weight and the rider's reach from elevation, creating local superiorities that the exhausted English couldn't match. These breaches spread like cracks in ice, threatening to shatter the entire formation. A knight on a black destrier aimed directly for Harold's banner. The horse jumped corpses, charged uphill, scattered ferdmen who threw themselves aside rather than be trampled. The knight's lance targeted the king himself. Harold's housecarls intercepted. 3 of them, working in concert, brought down the horse with coordinated spear thrusts. The knight fell hard. Before he could rise, a Danish axe split his helmet and the skull beneath. The ferdman felt the formation shifting around him. Men were being pushed backward by the cavalry's momentum. The wall wasn't breaking yet, but it was bending dangerously. Another concentrated charge might snap it completely. A riderless horse, maddened by pain from a spear in its flank, careened through the English ranks. It kicked indiscriminately, catching friend and foe alike. Its hoof caught the ferdman's already wounded shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. The horse continued past, trailing blood. Godric pulled him up. The tanner's son was limping badly now. Something had injured his leg during the melee. They held each other upright, 2 broken men pretending to be one functional soldier. The cavalry charge lost coherence. Horses couldn't maintain formation in the chaos of bodies and obstacles. Riders found themselves isolated, surrounded by English ferdmen who pulled them from their saddles and killed them with the brutal efficiency of farmers slaughtering livestock. Mail was good protection against slashing cuts, but gaps existed at joints, at the neck, under the arms. English blades found these gaps. A Norman knight crashed into the line, 3 men to the ferdman's left. His horse's momentum drove the English back 5 feet. The knight's sword killed 2 men in rapid succession. Then an English ferdman grabbed the horse's bridle, yanked its head down and sideways. The horse stumbled. Another ferdman thrust a spear into the knight's face through the eye slit of his helmet. The knight fell. His horse tried to run but was surrounded, hemmed in by bodies. Axes and spears brought it down. The ferdman watched a mounted Norman deliberately ride down an English housecarl, the horse's chest smashing into the warrior and driving him backward into his own ranks. The housecarl kept his feet somehow, got his hands on the horse's neck, and pulled with berserker strength. Horse and rider toppled. The housecarl landed on top of the knight, drew his dagger, and worked it through the mail at the knight's throat. Both men were screaming. Then only the housecarl was screaming, in triumph, in rage, in madness. Dead horses had created a rampart in some sections. The English used the carcasses as obstacles, fighting from behind them, stabbing at riders who tried to navigate around. The improvised fortifications held sections of the line that would have otherwise collapsed. A Norman knight penetrated deep into the English formation, his horse somehow navigating the carnage. He reached the 4th rank where the ferdman stood, swung his sword at Godric's head. Godric got his shield up, but the blow was powerful enough to shatter the wood and break Godric's arm. The tanner's son fell. The ferdman thrust his spear at the mounted knight. The point skittered off mail, found no purchase. The knight reversed his swing, aimed at the ferdman. The blade came down. The ferdman tried to dodge, too slow, too wounded. The sword hit his already damaged shoulder, cutting through the gambeson and into muscle. He fell backward, landed on his wounded side. Pain whited out his vision. When it cleared, the knight was raising his sword for a killing blow. Then a spear took the horse in the eye. The animal reared, screaming. The knight fought to stay mounted, failed, crashed to the ground in a clatter of mail. 5 English ferdmen swarmed him with daggers and axes. He died hard, but he died. The ferdman couldn't rise. His shoulder was ruined, his arms both useless now. He lay in the mud watching boots and hooves pass inches from his face. Someone stepped on his leg. He felt the bone crack. Didn't even scream. His voice had given out at some point and he hadn't noticed. The cavalry charge was breaking up. Too many dead horses, too many unhorsed knights, too much chaos. The Norman riders were withdrawing, those who could, leaving their dead and dying behind. The English had held. Barely, at immense cost, but held. Hans grabbed the ferdman, dragged him backward out of the fighting, the surgeon's assistants, collecting the wounded who might survive. They hauled him to the rear area and deposited him with dozens of others in similar condition. The ferdman lay staring at the sky, both arms useless, one leg broken, wounds bleeding from multiple locations. He'd survived the cavalry charge. That seemed impossible, miraculous even. Though miracles implied divine favour, and nothing about this day suggested God favoured anyone. Around him, men were dying from wounds that wouldn't kill quickly, but would kill certainly. The surgeon moved between them, making decisions. This one gets treatment. That one gets comfort. This one is already dead, but doesn't know it yet. The surgeon reached the ferdman, examined his wounds quickly. Both arms damaged but not severed. Leg broken but a clean break. Side wound reopened but not bleeding severely. Head wound superficial. Multiple cuts and punctures but nothing immediately fatal. The surgeon's expression suggested surprise that the ferdman was still alive. They splintered his leg with pieces of a broken spear shaft, rebound his arms, packed his wounds with cloth torn from dead men's clothing, gave him water mixed with something bitter that dulled the pain slightly, then moved on to the next broken body. The ferdman couldn't fight anymore, could barely move, but he could watch. From his position in the rear, he had a clear view of the ridge where the shield wall still stood, diminished, battered, bent but unbroken. The Normans had thrown infantry, archers, and cavalry against it. The wall had absorbed everything and held, but the sun was still high. Hours of daylight remained, and the Norman army showed no signs of retreating. The Normans regrouped with mechanical efficiency. Fresh infantry moved forward while cavalry repositioned to the flanks. Archers took station at intervals along the entire line. Duke William had committed his full strength to breaking the English ridge, and the attack showed no signs of ending until one army or the other ceased to exist. The ferdman lay among the wounded, watching the battle resume from a position of enforced observation. His broken leg prevented standing. His ruined arms prevented holding weapons. He'd become a spectator to the fight that would determine England's fate, reduced to witnessing rather than participating. The English wall had shrunk. What had started as a formation 300 yards wide now held perhaps 200 yards of ridge. The flanks had collapsed inward as casualties mounted and reserves dwindled. Men stood 3 deep in some sections instead of 5 or 6. The dead carpeted the slope so thickly that new corpses had to be stacked on old ones. A combined assault began, archers loosing while infantry advanced under their cover. The tactic forced the English into an impossible choice: raise shields against arrows and expose themselves to infantry, or keep shields forward against infantry and take arrows from above. The wall tried to split the difference, achieving neither goal effectively. Norman infantry hit the weakened line like a hammer striking cracked stone. The impact drove the English back 10 feet. Men stumbled over corpses, lost formation, created gaps. The gaps spread. Sections of the wall began to dissolve into individual fights rather than coordinated defence. A Norman wedge punched through the English left flank entirely. 20 knights in tight formation, their combined momentum unstoppable. They carved into the English rear, killing the wounded, cutting down the water carriers and surgeons, destroying the support structure that kept the wall functional. English ferdmen had to turn and face the breakthrough, weakening the main line even further. The ferdman watched men he'd marched with get slaughtered 30 yards from where he lay helpless. The surgeon who treated him took a Norman spear through his back. The man died without ceremony, his knowledge and skill rendered worthless by 18 inches of sharpened iron. The English counter-attacked the breakthrough with desperate ferocity. Housecarls abandoned their positions in the centre, rushed to the flank, hit the Norman wedge from the side. Danish axes rose and fell, mail split, men died. The Housecarls' discipline and skill pushed back the Norman knights, plugged the gap, restored something resembling a defensive line. But the centre had weakened when the Housecarls left. Norman infantry exploited the weakness immediately, surging forward, driving deeper into the English position. The wall wasn't a wall anymore, it was fragmenting into separate fights, isolated groups of defenders holding pockets of ground. Harold's dragon banner dipped. The ferdman's heart stopped. If the king had fallen, the battle was lost. Then the banner rose again. Someone had grabbed it when the bearer went down, kept it aloft. The symbol mattered more than the man holding it. As long as the dragon flew, men believed they could win. The Normans launched another cavalry charge, this one targeting the centre where Harold's banner marked the king's position. 50 mounted knights, fresh horses, riding in a tight wedge. They hit the weakened English centre like a battering ram hitting a rotted door. The impact was visible even from the ferdman's distant position. The English line bent inward, warped, nearly broke. Harold's housecarls formed a ring around their king, shields locked, presenting a circular fortress against the mounted assault. Horses crashed against the ring and died on English spears. Knights tried to break through and died on Danish axes, but the pressure was immense. The housecarl ring contracted as men fell and couldn't be replaced. Harold himself was fighting now. The ferdman could see the king's distinctive armour in the centre of the ring, could see his axe rising and falling, dropping Norman knights who'd broken through the first line of defence. A horn sounded from the Norman lines. The attack intensified across the entire front. Infantry, cavalry and archers coordinating in a final push to shatter English resistance. The Normans had spent hours softening the wall. Now they were committed to breaking it entirely. The English right flank collapsed. Not all at once, but in sections. First a dozen men broke and ran, then a score, then entire hundreds were streaming backward off the ridge. The rout spread like plague. Men who'd held for hours suddenly decided that survival trumped duty. Norman cavalry pursued the runners, cutting them down from behind. Easy kills. Exhausted men can't outrun horses. The cavalry rode through the fleeing English like reapers through wheat, leaving a trail of bodies stretching 100 yards from the ridge. The centre held despite the flanks collapsing. Harold's housecarls maintained their ring, refusing to break, buying time for the rest of the army to either rally or escape. The king's presence anchored the defence. As long as Harold stood, some men would stand with him. The ferdman watched a group of Norman archers position themselves with clear shots at the housecarl ring. Their target was obvious, the dragon banner and the king beneath it. High-value shot. End the battle with a single arrow. The archers drew. Their range was extreme. maybe 150 yards. Difficult shooting even for professionals. But they loosed together, a concentrated volley aimed at one small target. The arrows arced high, descended, struck. The dragon banner wavered. For a moment, nothing changed. Then it fell. A sound went through the English army that the Ferdman had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. A collective groan of despair, the death cry of hope itself. Men who'd been holding their ground suddenly lost the will. The wall didn't collapse, it evaporated. Harold was down. The rumour spread instantly, impossible to verify but universally believed. An arrow through the eye, through the throat, through the heart. The details varied, but the conclusion remained constant. The king was dead. The battle was lost. The English army shattered. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Others stood in shock, unable to process the sudden reversal. The Normans showed no mercy to either group. They killed the runners from behind and the stunned from the front. The housecarls surrounding where Harold had stood refused to break. They formed a tighter circle, fighting back to back against overwhelming numbers. These were professional warriors bound by oaths that superseded survival instinct. They would die defending their king's body because that was their purpose, their honour, their identity. The Normans surrounded the housecarl circle and methodically destroyed it. Fresh troops against exhausted defenders, 10 against 1 odds. The mathematics were inevitable. The housecarls died one by one, axes swinging until the very end, taking Normans with them but ultimately overwhelmed by numbers and fatigue. The last housecarl fell an hour before sunset. His death marked the end of organised English resistance on Senlac Ridge. What remained was slaughter. Normans hunting down fleeing Ferdmen, finishing the wounded, stripping the dead of anything valuable. The Ferdman lay motionless among the corpses, covered in enough blood that he looked dead already. Norman soldiers passed within feet of his position, didn't bother checking if he lived. Too many obviously dead bodies to waste time on questionable ones. He watched them search the battlefield, watched them find Harold's body, or what they claimed was Harold's body, mutilated beyond easy recognition. Watched them raise Norman banners where the dragon had flown. Watched England die in the span of a single afternoon. Darkness fell slowly, mercifully. The Normans established a camp on the ridge they'd bought with thousands of lives. Their victory celebrations were muted, too many of their own dead, too much blood spent for a prize that might yet turn poisonous. The Ferdman waited until full darkness, then began crawling. Both arms useless, one leg broken, but he could drag himself using his good leg and his elbows. Progress measured in inches, pain beyond description. But moving away from the Normans toward the forest, toward possible escape. Other survivors had the same idea. The Ferdman encountered them in the darkness, men crawling, limping, helping each other toward the trees. Nobody spoke. Silence was survival. Sound drew Norman patrols who were still hunting stragglers. A Norman patrol passed 20 feet from the Ferdman's position. He lay perfectly still, not breathing, praying his outline blended with the corpses scattered everywhere. The patrol moved on. He resumed crawling. The forest was perhaps 300 yards from where he'd fallen. The distance was impossible. He crawled it anyway, driven by instinct rather than thought. Survival stripped away everything civilized, left only animal determination to continue existing. He reached the tree line as false dawn coloured the eastern sky, collapsed in the undergrowth, unable to move another inch. Around him, other survivors were doing the same, broken men seeking shelter in darkness and foliage. The Ferdman lay still, listening to Norman voices calling to each other across the battlefield. They were collecting their own dead, stripping English corpses, beginning the grim accounting that followed every major battle. How many thousands had died? He'd stopped being able to count when the number exceeded what his mind could comfortably hold. Godric crawled out of the darkness and collapsed beside him. The tanner's son's arm hung at a wrong angle, clearly broken. His leg wound had soaked his trousers black with blood. But he was alive. They were both alive. That seemed impossible. They lay together without speaking, two survivors of a slaughter that had destroyed an army and a kingdom. The Battle of Hastings was over. The Normans had won. England would never be the same. The Ferdman closed his eyes, too exhausted for anything but unconsciousness. His last thought before darkness claimed him was simple and terrible. He'd survived the shield wall. Now he had to survive everything that came after. The Ferdman woke to agony that made the previous day's wounds feel trivial. His body had stiffened overnight into a mass of locked joints and screaming nerves. Every injury had settled into deep tissue, bones grinding, muscles torn, infections beginning their invisible work. Dawnlight filtered through the forest canopy. Norman voices still carried from the ridge. They were establishing permanent positions, building a fortified camp on ground soaked with English blood. The occupation had begun before the corpses cooled. Godric wasn't moving. The Ferdman thought him dead until he saw the shallow rise and fall of breathing. The tanner's son had lost consciousness and hadn't regained it. His broken arm had swollen to twice its normal size. The leg wound showed early signs of corruption, edges turning dark, flesh beginning to stink. Other survivors littered the forest floor like discarded refuse. Some were conscious and silent. Others moaned quietly. A few had died during the night, their bodies already growing cold. Maybe 30 men total in this patch of woodland. 30 survivors from a battle that had fielded 16,000. The Ferdman tried to move. His broken leg was useless, the splinter plied by the now-dead surgeon barely holding the bones aligned. His arms responded minimally. He could flex his fingers on the right hand, nothing on the left. His core wounds had stopped bleeding, but the stillness of clotted blood suggested his body had no blood left to spare. A man nearby was whispering prayers. Not Christian prayers. Older words in a dialect the Ferdman barely recognized. Prayers to Saxon gods that Christianity had supposedly erased. In extremity, men returned to older truths. The church's veneer was thin when death felt imminent. The Ferdman's mouth tasted like copper and rot. Thirst dominated every other sensation. He needed water or he'd die regardless of his wounds. The forest held a stream somewhere. He could hear it, maybe 50 yards distant. Impossible distance for a man who could barely crawl. He started anyway. Used his elbows and his good leg to drag himself toward the sound of running water. Progress measured in inches per minute. Pain was background noise now, constant and therefore ignorable. Only the goal mattered. A Norman patrol entered the forest. The Ferdman heard them before he saw them, mail rustling, French voices discussing the best method for finding English survivors. They were hunting systematically, checking every possible hiding spot. Survivors would be valuable, for information, for ransom if noble, or simply for the satisfaction of finishing what the battle had started. The Ferdman froze, didn't breathe. A Norman soldier passed within arm's reach, close enough that the Ferdman could see dried blood on his boots. English blood. The soldier was looking up into the trees, checking for men who'd climbed to hide. Didn't think to check the ground carefully. The Ferdman's coating of mud and blood made him indistinguishable from the forest floor. The patrol moved on. The Ferdman resumed crawling. Reached the stream after what felt like hours but was probably 30 minutes. lowered his face into the water and drank until his stomach cramped. The water was cold, clean, tasted of minerals and life. He drank more, ignoring the cramps. Movement in the water caught his attention. Fish, dozens of them, swimming upstream. October salmon run. Nature continuing its patterns regardless of human catastrophe. The fish represented food, protein, survival. He had no way to catch them with broken arms and a useless leg. A hand grabbed his shoulder. The Ferdman tried to spin, failed, managed only to roll onto his side. Godric loomed above him, conscious, but barely. The tanner's son had followed him to the water, driven by the same desperate thirst. They drank together without speaking, then lay on the bank, too exhausted to move further. The day passed in fragments. Norman patrols swept through twice more. Both times the Ferdman and Godric lay motionless in the undergrowth by the stream, trusting camouflage and luck. Both times the Normans passed without seeing them. Other survivors found the stream. By midday, perhaps a dozen wounded English had gathered by the water, a random collection of broken men with no leadership, no plan, no hope beyond surviving the next hour. One man had been a Thegn. His mail marked him as nobility, but an axe wound had split his skull and left him simple-minded. He sat rocking back and forth, muttering his own name repeatedly. A boy no older than 15 appeared through the trees. He'd taken a spear through his stomach during the battle. The wound was mortal, but killing him slowly. He asked if anyone knew how to ease the pain. Nobody answered. They'd all seen gut wounds before. The boy would die in agony over 2 or 3 days unless someone showed mercy. Nobody had the strength to provide that mercy. The Ferdman dozed fitfully, waking every time pain spiked beyond tolerance. His wounds were corrupting now. He could smell the sweetish rot of infection setting in. Without proper treatment, the infections would kill him within days. With proper treatment, he might survive. Proper treatment required a surgeon, clean water, herbs, rest, food. He had none of these things. By late afternoon, Norman patrols had ceased. They'd either swept the area thoroughly or decided the remaining survivors weren't worth hunting. The forest grew quiet except for the stream and the occasional moan from wounded men. Godric tried to stand, failed, tried again, using a tree for support, managed to get upright on his good leg. His broken arm hung useless, but he could hop if he used a branch as a crutch. He looked down at the Ferdman, his expression asking a question without words. The Ferdman understood. Godric could move, the Ferdman couldn't. Staying together meant both dying. Separating gave Godric a chance. The mathematics were brutal but clear. The Ferdman nodded. Godric nodded back. No farewells, no promises to send help that would never arrive. The tanner's son turned and hopped away through the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. The Ferdman never saw him again. Darkness fell. The temperature dropped. October nights in England were cold, and the Ferdman wore blood-soaked rags that provided no warmth. Hypothermia became a real threat. He tried to cover himself with leaves and forest debris, managed a thin layer before exhaustion stopped him. The boy with the gut wound died sometime after midnight. His moaning had been a constant background sound, so the silence when it stopped was noticeable. The Ferdman didn't check the body. Death needed no confirmation. The next day brought rain. Cold autumn rain that turned the forest floor to mud and soaked the survivors to their bones. The Ferdman drank rainwater collected in his cupped hand, the hand that still worked minimally. The rain washed some of the blood and filth from his wounds, which might help or might introduce new infections. Impossible to know. 2 more men died during the second night. The simple-minded thegn and an older Ferdman whose wounds the Ferdman hadn't been able to see clearly. That left maybe 8 survivors in the immediate area. How many had escaped into other parts of the forest? How many had made it home? The Ferdman would never know the answers. On the 3rd day, Norman soldiers returned. Not a patrol this time, but a work detail. They were collecting English dead from the forest, adding them to the mass graves being dug near the battlefield. The corpses were too numerous to bury individually. Pits 10 feet deep, bodies stacked like cordwood, covered with earth and forgotten. The work detail found the survivors by the stream. The Normans weren't hunting anymore, they were simply working, and the discovery was incidental. They gathered the wounded English with rough efficiency, no particular cruelty but no gentleness either. The Ferdman was dragged by his good leg, the broken leg bouncing over roots and stones, pain beyond screaming. They dumped the survivors in a clearing where other wounded English had been collected. Perhaps 40 men total, all in various states of dying. Norman guards watched them with bored attention. These weren't valuable prisoners worth ransom, just broken enemies too wounded to threaten anyone. A Norman surgeon examined the wounded. His assessment was purely practical. This one might survive, that one won't. This one isn't worth the effort. The Ferdman fell into the might survive category, though barely. The surgeon cleaned his wounds roughly, applied new bandages, splinted his broken leg properly. No gentleness, but competent care. Norman self-interest. Living prisoners could provide labour once healed. Food came that evening, bread and weak broth, distributed by English prisoners who'd surrendered during the battle. The Ferdman recognised none of them. His world had shrunk to strangers and corpses, days blurred together. The infected wounds were treated with burning poultices that made the initial injuries feel pleasant by comparison. His broken bones were reset properly, the process requiring 3 men to hold him down while the surgeon worked. He screamed until his voice gave out, then continued screaming silently. Some wounded died despite treatment. Others began to recover. The Ferdman existed in the uncertain middle, not dying quickly, not healing quickly, just persisting. His arms regained limited function. His leg remained immobile, but the bone was knitting. The infections receded, driven back by treatments that hurt worse than the wounds. 2 weeks after the battle, the survivors were sorted. Those who could walk were formed into work details. Those who couldn't were loaded onto carts. The Ferdman couldn't walk yet, so he was loaded with the other cripples and transported to a Norman camp 5 miles from the battlefield. The camp held hundreds of English prisoners, some wounded, many simply captured during the rout. They were being put to work building fortifications for the Norman occupation. The wounded who recovered enough would join the work gangs. Those who didn't recover would be released. Useless mouths weren't worth feeding. The Ferdman spent a month in the camp, healing slowly, watching England transform under Norman control. Duke William was crowned king in London on Christmas Day, the ceremony performed in a city half burned during the conquest. The English nobility had been shattered at Hastings. Those who survived were fleeing north or submitting to Norman rule. When the Ferdman's leg could bear weight again, he was released. Given no provisions, no weapons, nothing but his life. He limped out of the camp in January, 3 months after Hastings, into a country that had become foreign during his captivity. His village was gone, not destroyed, simply empty. The people had fled or died or been taken. His farm was overgrown, his wife and children vanished. He searched for a week, found no trace. They'd either survived and fled somewhere he couldn't follow, or they hadn't survived at all. The Ferdman became a wanderer. His wounds had left him crippled. The left arm never regained full function. The right leg had healed wrong and caused a permanent limp. He couldn't farm, couldn't fight, could barely survive. He drifted north, joining the stream of refugees fleeing Norman-controlled territories. He'd survived Hastings, survived his wounds, survived imprisonment, but England as he'd known it was dead. The shield wall had held for hours, had broken in minutes, and its breaking had broken everything. Years later, he still dreamed of the wall, the sound of shields locking together, the smell of blood and shit and fear, the face of the Norman with blue eyes who died on an English spear, the faces of men who'd stood beside him and died beside him, the grinding pressure of bodies pushing from behind, the knowledge that breaking meant dying, but holding meant dying too, just slower. He'd fought in the shield wall at Hastings. He'd survived it. That survival felt less like victory than penance, condemned to remember what England had lost, to carry the memory of a world that would never return, to live on in a kingdom now ruled by the very men who'd destroyed it, on a ridge in Sussex on a cold October day in 1066.